Prithvi Shantirantarikshakam Shantir Dyaus Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantir Me Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress and anxieties from our body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. In the verses 10 and 11, which we saw last time, we saw how the Upanishad shows that the journey, if we must use the word journey, is not from one place to another place, but from the gross to the subtle realities. Realities which are more inward, more subtle, and because they are more subtle and more inward, they are greater. So it's a journey uncovering our own true nature. And because our true self is the subtlest of all, the most sukshma, it is deeply hidden in the cave of the heart. And that's why it's difficult to see, which is what is now being described in verse number 12. Esha sarveshu bhuteshu gudho atma na prakashate drishyate tu agreya buddhya sukshmaya sukshmadarshibhihi. The Atman, hidden in all beings, reveals itself not to all, but is seen only to the seers of the subtle through their pointed and subtle intellect. So we have seen this idea has come before, that the true self, while some of us who have read the Upanishad or the Gita may have some intellectual idea that there is some reality other than the body and mind which are objects of our own experience. But still, it's still a concept. We haven't really we are aware of its existence and yet not aware of it at the same time. And that is the whole mystery behind this theory. In Sanskrit, it's called vivarta. Vivarta means the whole superimposition, idea of the superimposition, that you see and yet you not see. Going back to the classical example of a coiled rope, which is mistaken for a snake. So now, when I see that rope in a room with insufficient light, I'm not able to recognize it's a rope, and in that place I see a snake. Now, even when I'm seeing the snake, I'm really still seeing the rope, because there is really no snake there. So I cannot say I'm not seeing the rope, because, well, I am seeing the rope. And yet, I'm not seeing the rope as a rope. I'm seeing the rope as something else. Which is why, in that example, you can say, I'm seeing the rope, also I'm not seeing the rope. In other words, I'm seeing the rope in reality, but I'm not seeing the rope in practice. Exactly in the same way, we are seeing the Atman and we are not seeing the Atman at the same time. Let me go back to that rope and snake example. So when I make a statement and say, this is the snake, I can divide that statement into two statements. So this is the snake can be divided into two observations, that this is something, and the second is this something is a snake. So if you break up that observation into two statements, the first statement is correct. This is something. That's absolutely true. The second statement, that this something is a snake, that's wrong. So similarly, applying that same thing to our own thing, that when I say, I'm a human being, it is like, this is a snake. So I'm a human being is a statement that I can break up into two. I am someone. And that someone is a human being. So the first part of the statement, I am someone, is truth, absolute truth. But I'm identifying that someone in a wrong way. Instead of recognizing that someone is the Atman or the divine being, I'm saying it's a human being. So you see the parallel between the two. So we cannot say that the Atman is not revealing itself to us. Atman is revealing itself to us all the time. But for the Atman, we wouldn't know anything in this world. Because Atman is pure consciousness. And consciousness is a prerequisite for knowledge. If I have to know that this is the table, I must be conscious of the table before I get the knowledge of the table. I must be conscious that it's day before I know that it's a day. I must be conscious that the sun has risen in order for me to see the sun. So the sun's light itself is not enough for me to see the sun. Because there may be the sun's light, and yet I may be fast asleep. And that sun's light cannot reveal the sun to me because I haven't become conscious of the sun. So consciousness is a prerequisite of all knowledge. So we can say that we have not seen the Atman, but it's good to recognize that whatever we see in the universe, we see it in and through the Atman. A kind of a crude example would be, none of us has seen our eyes or eyeballs. You cannot see it. You can see its reflection in a mirror. But we could say, in some ways, that without the eyes I wouldn't be able to see anything, but our own eyes we don't see. The Atman is a little bit like that. So when it is said, this Atman doesn't reveal itself, this Atman hidden in all beings reveals itself not to all, this has to be understood in that sense. It doesn't reveal itself as it is. It reveals itself as something else. Just as the rope reveals itself as a snake, but not as it truly is, in that semi-darkness. In the same way, the Atman does not reveal itself to us as the Atman, but reveals itself to us as something else. So what is this darkness or a semi-darkness? The semi-darkness is the darkness of Maya. That's the darkness that we pray to at the beginning of every class, that lead me from darkness to light. That is the darkness of Maya. It's because of this that this Atman is hidden. So if we are not able to see the Atman as Atman right now, not to be surprised, because that's the experience of pretty much most people. At the same time, it should be a matter of surprise, because nothing is closer to us than our own selves. And that we know a lot of things which are far away and distant, but don't know our own selves, is kind of a tragedy. But it's something that we can understand, because everyone is more or less sailing in the same boat, except those who have become enlightened. Now, does that mean that we will never be able to see the Atman as it is? And then this verse says, no, it can be seen. So that's the one very hopeful note in this word, drishyate. The Upanishad does not say that there is the Atman, just believe in it. Just keep on worshipping in it, to go on doing arati to it, offer some flowers to it. That's not what the Upanishad says. It says drishyate, it can be seen. That is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna told Narendranath when he went and asked him, have you seen God? And Sri Ramakrishna said, yes, I have seen him, and you can see him also. Drishyate, God can be seen. Now what do I need to do in order for me to see the Atman in its true nature? That is what is said here. Seen by the seers of the subtle through their pointed and subtle intellect. Now, these levels of subtlety is what were described in the earlier two verses. And we can see this subtlety even in our day-to-day lives. Even in secular contexts. We know that sometimes among the people you live and work with, some people might need a very detailed explanation about everything. Not just about work-related things, but even reactions. Some people can't understand subtle reactions. You have to be and so you'll need to kind of show with all movement of hand and so on. And sometimes teachers find that among students in classrooms as well, that there would be some extremely naughty students who need to be given some kind of a punishment they can understand. And of course, the styles of punishment have changed over the years. In my generation and earlier, there used to be kinds of punishment. Will be beating, and with physical punishment, beating, which probably is no longer a norm in schools. But some students can understand only that kind of language. And then there would be others who just a kind of a stern look might be enough. So they are more sensitive. They can see these subtle forms of admonition they can understand. And then some others might understand even subtler versions. In Vedanta, sometimes they categorize students also. So there is the highest category of students in Vedanta. They say Uttama Adhikari, the cream of students. And what makes them the highest category? It's simply this. It's almost like a fruit which is already ripe, ready to be eaten. So when such a student comes, all that the teacher has to tell the student is, you are the Atman, you are the infinite one. And a student says, I am the infinite one. Problem solved. No need of studying anything, no need of meditation, japa, nothing is ready because enlightenment has come. All that the student needed was someone to tell him or her what the reality is, and at once they know. And that's why they are called the highest category of students. Then there is the middle, the average students. Now sometimes you tell them, oh, you are the Atman. And then they say, okay, but it still doesn't make sense. How can I be the Atman? The Atman is immortal, I'm a mortal, and Atman is without beginning, without end. I was born the other day. So these doubts that come in the mind, that's a hurdle. And so that prevents the student from at once becoming enlightened, because these questions and these doubts come. And therefore, for such a student then, simply hearing the truth from the teacher is not enough. They need to then reflect deeply on it, keep on thinking about it, and solve their doubts and questions one by one. And when those doubts are removed, then they become enlightened. But then there is a third category of student called Kanishtha Adhikari, who their doubts may be resolved intellectually, but still they say, well, I think I understand now, but still, as I go about in my day-to-day, carrying out my day-to-day activities, I still feel like a human being. Intellectually, no doubts. I like the idea that I am the Atman, but that's not something that is become a matter of experience to me yet. And then they have to do that third thing called nididhyasana, or a deep, deep exploration of one's own self. A deep contemplation is needed. And therefore, depending on the level at which we are, our practices also will change. And that's what I mean by these different levels of subtlety. So similarly, these subtleties are present in spiritual life as well. That is why some students who might, now luckily for us, every one of us doesn't need to be a scholar in Sanskrit, because most of these Sanskrit texts are now translated. So we can pick up any translation in a language that we are familiar with, and we get to understand what every verse is saying. So the general meaning of the verse is obvious here. But then, a lot of times, texts like these have layers of meaning. So just reading and understanding the language is not enough. We must then read between the lines and see, what does it really mean? What does seers of the subtle through the pointed and subtle intellect, what does this pointed intellect really mean? What does this subtle intellect really mean? So when these questions come, that is why these great acharyas have written commentaries. So when you read Shankaracharya's commentary on it, or the explanation given by different Vedanta teachers, then they are able to provide greater details and make this a little bit more intelligible. And so that is what is meant by this sukshma darshipihi, those people who are able to see sukshma things. Now what do we need to do in order to acquire this ability to see sukshma realities? The first thing we need is clearly sensitivity. Insensitive people, it's very difficult, because spirit is the subtlest of all. So we need to be sensitive. And sensitiveness goes well along with some amount of discipline or control. Because if I'm sensitive, I mean, think about it this way. If someone is sensitive to sound or light, or there are any number of sensitivities, then we have to be careful about what kind of sound I want to allow inside and what kind of sound I need to protect myself from if I'm extra sensitive to it. So similarly, here sensitivity means being sensitive to these higher, subtler, deeper realities of life. But sensitivity means I become sensitive also of the grosser realities of life. It's not that you can't filter it out because you're just sensitive. And so that's where the discipline comes in, that I need to then recognize what kind of sensitivities I should allow inside and what kind of sensitivities should be stopped. And therefore, sensitivity goes along with self-restraint and control over the mind. Because then I'm able to then know exactly where I should put my mind, in what kind of thinking, in what kind of activity, something that will make me stronger at every level, physically, mentally, morally, emotionally, and so on. Something that will take me nearer to God, nearer to my own true self, and keep out everything that makes me weaker or that takes me away from my spiritual ideal. So, sensitivity, which can come through leading an ethical, moral life, along with a self-restraint, knowing exactly when and where to say yes and when and where to say no. And that's that kind of an inner discipline and a prayerful, devotional attitude is able to provide that, make our mind more and more capable of being sensitive to these subtle realities. And one of the ways, as I've often mentioned, is the Gayatri prayer. The Dhiyo Yonaf Prachodaya, that Dhi, the awakening of the Dhi, is really what this sensitivity is about. Very briefly, Swami Vivekananda points out in his lectures on Raja Yoga that the yogis, this Indian form of psychology, the yogis say that most of our thought processes, thinking and all, emotional, etc., go along two primary channels in the body. And in Sanskrit, they are called Ida and Pingala. And these yogis say it kind of takes the shape of number 8. So one goes like this, and the other goes like this. So one like this and the other like this. So together it becomes like number 8. So one is Ida, the other is Pingala. So all of our thinking, all of our emotions, everything travels along these two mystical channels in the body. Some people have tried to correlate them with the nervous system. I'm not an expert in that, so neither is there any way to confirm whether they really are. But some people have made an attempt to do so. But it's good to recognize that these Ida Pingala are primarily mystical ways of pointing out these nervous channels. Now, there is a third channel in all of us, and that is called Sushumna. And that goes exactly along the spinal column. So most of our thinking occurs along the side channels. And according to yoga, that middle channel, Sushumna, is closed in most people. Maybe a little bit may be open. They say that if a little bit more opening than it is now, if it occurs, that person may be considered a genius. It might get a Nobel Prize or something. Maybe Einstein's was opened a little bit. Again, there's no way, it's just speculation. But the fact that some of these great inventors and discoverers, they are able to see something that most of us couldn't. There has to be something, some greater opening has occurred somewhere. And so, once that middle channel gets opened, and that gets opened only when the life becomes goal-oriented, and that goal is a spiritual goal here in this case. So while we might have many different goals in life, our ultimate goal has to be this transcendent truth. And if my thinking, my activities, all of my things in my life are somehow geared towards that ultimate goal, and ideally my all other intermediate goals are somewhere along the way. So if my intermediate goals are in the opposite direction, then it's time consuming. You can't be going to the east and west at the same time. So if my intermediate goals are in the same direction and the ultimate goal is the Atman, then if I order my life in a way that I will go closer and closer towards God, closer and closer towards their reality, then that's how this subtlety, that subtle channel will open. And so the Gayatri prayer is essentially a prayer for the opening of that central channel. And yogis say that as that channel opens and our consciousness rises higher and higher along that inner channel, then wonderful experiences start coming. In Sri Ramakrishna's conversations in the Gospel, you'll find in several places he has described the different experiences when that, the word that gets often used is Kundalini, and the serpent is a symbol of that. Again, it's all mystical language. There is no serpent inside you. And that snake is very different from the rope snake analogy. And it's not even a snake. Again, it's completely symbolical language. But the idea is, as my center of consciousness begins to rise higher and higher along that central channel, that is when these greater and subtler realities become revealed to me. And that's when these spiritual experiences come, one after the other. And you can imagine in someone like Sri Ramakrishna's case, that whole central channel must have been just fully open. That's why he's constantly having all these great experiences, constantly going into samadhi. And we would consider ourselves blessed if that central channel gets opened even a little. And that can happen through the practice of any or all of these yogas. That can occur through devotion, through love of God, through the practicing of karma yoga, doing everything selflessly, without always calculating one's own self-interest. It can come through the practice of jnana yoga, purifying our capacity to reason. It can come through any of these yogas. And that is what is being referred to here. So let me read this verse again. The Atman, hidden in all beings, reveals itself not to all, but is seen only by the seers or the subtle through their pointed and subtle intellect. Verse 13. Yacchetvang manasi pradnya tadyachet jnana atmani jnanamatmani mahatini yachet tadyachet shanta atmani. The wise should merge the speech in the mind, and that mind in the intellect in the great self, and that great self again in the self of peace. So this is very briefly those different levels of subtlety that were described in verses 11 and 12. It just shows how we go from the gross to the subtle. Although it's mentioned speech, the speech here stands for all senses. So what does it mean, merge the speech in the mind? It really means where my consciousness is at any given moment. Throughout the day, our consciousness keeps shifting. So there are times when with let's say if there is some pain in the body, then no matter what we are engaged in doing, we always remain conscious of that pain. So my consciousness, the body demands as much of my consciousness as possible. So my consciousness remain parked, it's like in your car. If you have a bunch of things to attend to, while you go to a mall, you park your car in the mall. You go to your office, you have your own parking space. You come home, you park it in your garage. So just like the car itself can be parked in many different places, depending on which places you frequent. So here, our consciousness, just imagine it to be like a car. So how often is my consciousness parked in my body? How often is my consciousness parked in my mind? How often is my consciousness parked in my higher thinking ability, the buddhi or the intellect, and so on? So wherever our car is parked, we are affected by whatever happens in that parking space. Think about it this way. Let's say you have gone somewhere and you have parked a car in a parking garage, and then you have gone for work. And the garage is, say, 2 blocks away. And then you hear the news, oh, there's been maybe fire, and the parking garage is on fire. Now, you would be worried if your car is parked there. If your car is not parked there, you might feel concerned, but nowhere as much concern if your car wasn't there. Let's say someone says a parking garage is on fire and says, oh my God, my car is there. And then later on it turns out it's not that parking garage where your car is, but some other parking garage. And then you are relieved. You say, oh, my car is fine. So wherever our consciousness is parked, we become identified with that place. And whatever happens to that place happens to me. So if my consciousness is parked in the body, then I'm concerned with whatever is happening to the body. If my consciousness is parked in my intellect, then I may not be as much concerned what happens to the body at that time. And that's why the example I often give is when you're engaged in some very deep activity, which needs a lot of concentration, or something that you truly enjoy doing, then at that time, even if you're hungry, even if it's a meal time, you don't care. Because that time, your consciousness is not parked as much in the body as it in your mind or in your intellect and so on. So that's really what this merging here means. So can I take my consciousness, again, this sounds, I hope it's not sounding too esoteric. Now what does it mean, taking your consciousness? Essentially, what I'm identifying it with. So the why should merge the speech in the mind really means, can I, as much as possible, or at least during this practice, stop identifying with my senses and begin identifying with the mind. And once I'm able to identify myself fully with the mind, which is more subtle than the senses, then next I should identify with something which is even more subtle than the mind, and that's the intellect or the buddhi, the power of intuition. Then it goes to what is called here, translated here as great self. Mahat Atma is exactly the same as Hiranyagarbha. It was mentioned in the earlier verses. The subtle self identified with the entire cosmos. That is, my own little, the self identified with my subtle body would be my own subtle self. But the self identified with the subtle bodies of everyone in the universe, that would be Hiranyagarbha. So again, you are broadening out your identification from this one individual to this entire creation. And that is what is meant here by the great self. And when that consciousness broadens out, gets identified beyond this little individual, then you should identify with what you described here as self of peace, means that ultimate self, the real self, the Atman. All the others are self only provisionally. But the real self is this, the self of peace. Again, why a self of peace? Why peace? It's just because the Upanishad itself has called everyone a self. So even the great self, and then to distinguish it from that great self, you call it the self of peace. Give some different name to distinguish it between the Hiranyagarbha, the Atman, and the Buddhi, and so on. The bottom line is that the ability to perceive subtle things, the ability to remain immersed in subtle things will provide me that strength to identify with subtle things. A simple thing is like this. Think about it this way. There is a Sanskrit verse which says that in the beginning, it may be helpful for most of us to do a ritualistic worship, because that's not so subtle. It's not just in the mind. You're actually doing something with your hands. So it helps to focus the mind. But then that kind of ritualistic worship should make my mind pure enough, strong enough then to be able to merge it into the subtler aspects of worship, which is what the mental worship is. So can I then continue doing worship even when there are no puja things around me? Can I just be sitting there and go through the whole puja in my mind? Now that's more subtle. It's easier to pick up something and do something, but try it out and see. Even to hold, even to kind of do the entire worship in the mind, imagine that you're taking the incense in your hand and then you're waving it before the deity and the altar. Everything is in your mind. Now that's very subtle. And while it may be possible for you to sit and do the actual puja for 15 or 20 minutes, to kind of sit 20 minutes and go through all those steps and do everything mentally is a little bit more difficult, because you're only there with very subtle visualizations and mind. It can get even more subtle then. And for instance, instead of visualizing the incense or the light you are waving before the deity, then you think that the light is the primal element of light that is being presented before this cosmic reality. So it gets even more subtle. You are not just visualizing some form. Now it's slowly becoming more abstract. And we know our ability to remain with these abstract things is limited. It's much easier to be doing things. That's really what this being with subtle thing means. That is why it is so much more easy in the beginning to, relatively speaking, to think of the divine with the help of some form, some sound, because that's subtle, but it is helpful, because eventually we need to touch that reality which goes beyond the idea of form, beyond the idea of sound, beyond name. So that's even more subtle. So we have to start from where we are, take the support of whatever our mind can make use of, but recognize that eventually we have to evolve so that we can go towards the subtler aspects of the truth. because the Atman is the subtlest of all. It's a little bit like when a little baby who is crawling on all fours may want to start walking eventually. So the babies sometimes might take the support of something when they try to get up and take a few steps, and that's fine. You need support. But eventually, we need to be able to walk without taking the support of things. That's the idea. So all the supports that we can take in spiritual life are fine, but to recognize that all the supports are meant to make us stronger so that we will be able to pursue our journey from the sthula to the sukshma, and from the sukshma to the more sukshma, more subtle, more subtle, more subtle, until we stand face to face with the reality. And that's why we have to become that perceivers of the subtle truths. Because that is what the Upanishad says. The more I'm able to see the subtle truths, the more ability I have to remain with the subtle ideas, the closer I will go to that reality. I'll just conclude with the story that Sri Ramakrishna used to tell about this fisherwoman who one day, after she had sold all fish, couldn't go home because it started raining, there was storm. So she sought shelter in one home, and that happened to be the home of a flower seller, and said, could I please stay here for night, and tomorrow morning after the weather improves, I can go home. And they say, yeah, you're welcome. So they give her a place in their porch, an enclosed porch, but they had a lot of flowers there. And so this lady tries to sleep, but the smell of the flowers is unbearable because she is used to that smell of fish. And so she just couldn't sleep in that smell of flowers. And then finally she gets an idea, and then she puts a little water on that basket in which she was selling fish, covers her head, and that beautiful smell of fish. Then she snores whole night. The example is given to show that our level of comfort, if I'm comfortable with that smell, then even the fragrance of beautiful flowers will be unbearable. And that can happen. When we become too comfortable with dwelling in these perishable toys of the world, then ideas about God and things can sometimes become a matter of curiosity, but we may not be able to dwell there for a long time. Sometimes Narendranath, Vivekananda, would go to Dakshineshwar with a few friends of his, and they would go and sit in Ramakrishna's room, and Sri Ramakrishna would start speaking about God, about Brahman, etc. And his friends who had no interest in spirituality, after a few minutes, they started getting kind of restless because, what's this, all this talk about God and spirituality? And then Sri Ramakrishna would notice it and then would say, oh, why don't you go and watch these? Take a look at the campus, look at the buildings. Or sometimes they themselves will say, or tell Narendra, you sit here as long as you want, we'll wait outside at the boat. So if my comfort zone is dwelling in this materialistic, perishable things of the world, then which are very, very gross compared to the subtle realities of spiritual life, then I may not be able to dwell there or remain immersed there or be comfortable there for a long time. So in order for me to that Sukshmadarshi, the ability to see subtle things, I need to practice being in the company of subtle ideas as much as possible. And that's why the daily practice of japa and meditation is really a practice to make my mind dwell with these subtler, finer realities of life, even if it is for a few minutes in the morning and few minutes in the evening, then when you read the Upanishad and when you read the words of these great ones, when you read the scriptures, when you read this, again, at the level of the intellect, I'm training my mind to be immersed in these subtle realities. So the more my mind I'm able to withdraw from these external, perishable, material things, and the more my mind feels comfortable remaining with these subtle realities, the closer I'm going to God. So if one way we want to measure our spiritual progress, and this would be one parameter we could compare with. How long can I keep myself thinking, either intellectually or meditating, on these subtle things? And how often my mind drags me towards its more sthula demands and compulsions of life. So, any thoughts, ideas, questions on what we have seen today? Yeah.
Swamiji, can you comment on Atma Vichara or self-inquiry in the context of the various supports that are available? Is Atma Vichara more for, more subtle as a practice, and is it necessary to maybe gradually, maybe start with ritualistic worship, then japa, and then Atma Vichara? Is there a kind of gradation of subtlety in terms of the practices?
No, I mean, everyone doesn't have to start necessarily with ritualistic worship, because the starting point of all of us is not always the same. I mean, if we believe in the idea of rebirth, then we don't always start at the same point, because we have a long past behind us. We don't know how much or what we have done already. Maybe in spiritual practice we may have done a lot of things in our spiritual practice in our earlier births. And so we already some of us might come with already some of these first stages done, already accomplished. That's why you see in some cases, they don't necessarily have to go right from ABC. So there isn't a rigid rule about that. And one way is to Atma Vichara is definitely dealing with subtle things. And if we find that I'm able to do Atma Vichara and remain in that Vichara for a sustained amount of time, not as some kind of an imposition, but I truly enjoy doing that, it means that my mind feels comfortable thinking about it. And I think that would be good. That's great.
Swamiji, when you look at all the yoga classes where you sort of see the different postures and how people sort of try to use those postures for physical well-being, but how does that connect with the Susukshma opening with the mind and the Atman and the subtlety that goes from that physical well-being to the spiritual well-being?
I mean, in general, you could say that a relatively healthy state of mind, healthy body, and what I look upon this, the sign of health as simply getting out of the way. That is, how and when can I say my body is reasonably healthy? And one way of understanding is that my body does not get in the way. For instance, now, if all the time when I'm trying to meditate, if my main struggle is with my posture itself, that after 2 minutes I start wiggling and my shoulder starts paining and this starts paining, then how am I going to think about God? So some of these yoga postures might help keep my joints lubricated. Well, I mean, the idea is, and we have seen in our own lives, when we feel a sense of physical health, we feel lighter. We don't even feel the body. So if the body is making its presence felt in some way, that means the body is saying there is something wrong. Ideally, we shouldn't even feel the body. That's the healthiest form. Same thing with regard to the mind. When is the mind healthy? I don't even feel the mind. Which is like the best car. The best car would be, you don't even feel you are in a car. If the car is all making all sounds and jerks and this and that, then you say, oh, there's something wrong with the car, right? So similarly, the body and mind, if they are in their pristine condition, you wouldn't even feel them. Every time the mind makes its presence felt in the form of stress or worry or anxiety, the body through its aches and pains and all of that, it's a problem. Now, yoga postures can help deal with, I'm not so sure about the mind, but definitely keep the body reasonably well. Now, that's how I see it. Now, the asanas, etc., they are a part of a different system of yoga called the Hatha Yoga, which is also a path to spiritual life. And these physical asanas are only a preliminary part of that. Now, many people who do the asanas, they are not necessarily taking up a practice of Hatha Yoga as a form of being enlightened. Because from the benefits, the physical benefits of these asanas are enormous and they are immediate. They are much more tangible. And so a lot of people do this yoga for just keeping themselves physically fit, which is fine. And so long as we recognize the utility of that and use the benefit of that, then to pursue one's spiritual practice in whichever way one is accustomed to, I think that should be good. The only thing that we have to be a little bit careful about is that sometimes the perspective can be lost. Sometimes the desire to keep the body healthy can, if we are not careful, become an obsession into physical health. Now, for a spiritual seeker, that kind of obsession is an obstacle. Then it's like I'm more worried about keeping my body well than about knowing the Atman. So, remaining healthy and being obsessive about something, we have to it's a fine boundary. We have to be careful that it doesn't go there.
Swamiji, you mentioned this word vivarta. There's also another word adhyasa. Is that the same meaning? Both of these?
Yeah, they're used in the same context.
Same context.
Yeah. Okay. Adhyasa means superimposition.
And so is vivarta.
Vivarta,
also.
yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Swamiji, this is my observation specifically for myself. As we do some practice, spiritual practice, we become more subtle, and we feel that we are making progress or seeing more, becoming more subtle. But we feel at some point we become more comfortable, we see the life is going well, and we kind of rest, or we don't make any progress, and we go back to the original position.
Yep, that's why perseverance is very important. Shouldn't stop.
Yeah, we blame it to all other activities what we are doing for the life, and
yeah, but deep down we know no blaming will. It's a little bit like sometimes it can happen if you read the life of some of the mountaineers. even those who go to, say, scale Mount Everest or something, you need tremendous amount of willpower even there, because even those who have gone to the base camp and then the first and the second stage, and sometimes things, as you go higher and higher, there are greater challenges. Sometimes it can be extremely painful, and there is a great temptation to give up, to say that, well, I've already reached a height where most people haven't reached. Most people in the world haven't done it. And so, okay, I may not have reached the summit, but I've reached here, and I feel good about it. And then I'm not going to go down again. It can happen. And that's where then the progress can get stalled. And so therefore, one just must push, push, push. The good thing about it is that nothing is permanently lost. So if we go to a certain level and then for whatever reason don't proceed beyond that, then it doesn't mean that in the next life, so we die unenlightened, but a fairly advanced stage, that doesn't mean that next life you have to start from the scratch again. So you continue from where you stopped. And therefore, what you have experienced, what you have attained spiritually is never lost. Your intellectual accomplishments, you have to study the Gita again, study the Kathopanishad again. If you don't want to study the Kathopanishad again, you better get enlightened. Otherwise, okay. So, yeah. Yes.
Swamiji, you gave that example of the car in the garage and being conscious, your consciousness being where you have parked the car.
Mm-hmm.
So that consciousness, is that a property of the mind? And is that different from the pure consciousness?
No, it is pure consciousness identified with that thing at that time. Consciousness is only one. So it's like when I'm extremely hungry, then my consciousness is so much identified with the body, then it's parked in my body. Or when I'm thinking about something intensely, then this consciousness is parked in my mind, because that part of my personality is now activated. So that way, my identification keeps on going from body, mind, senses, body, mind, senses. Occasionally as a devotee of God, or occasionally as a spiritual seeker when I'm meditating. The rest of the time, my consciousness keeps on hovering with these different roles and different this thing. And the one way of examining whether I'm making progress is to see how often is my consciousness identifying me in some spiritual sense, either as a spiritual seeker or as a devotee or as a child of God. Because then when I see myself as a child of God, then that consciousness is not simply parked in the body or mind. It is at a more subtler level.
Right, but Swamiji, we practice meditation and mind controlling the mind to keep the consciousness in a particular place.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it seems like we are
so that
using
time,
the mind
when you are meditating, when you are trying to focus your mind on your Ishta, Ishta is a much more subtler reality than your body, mind and everything. So when your mind gets completely concentrated on your chosen deity, then that is where your consciousness is parked. But the reason we find it difficult is that it has gotten so identified with this that it's reluctant to leave this completely and go and dwell inside in the heart of your Ishta. That's the challenge. Yeah.
So, Swamiji, first of all, it's clear that in Vedanta there's no grade inflation. I can say that given I still feel very much like a human, I'm in the third of the levels of
All of us are. So you have a lot of company.
And then Swamiji, you talked a lot about how we can develop our subtlety through japa and meditation. Are there ways, things we can do in our daily life as we engage with work, life, family that can also help increase the
Sure.
subtlety?
I mean, even think about it this way. When we see there is so much suffering in the world, not all of us are able to feel that suffering equally. Because, the level of feeling is also directly connected with our openness to subtleties. That's one of the ways we could do it. Okay, so we'll stop here today, and next week we will do verse number 14. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So tomorrow is Holi and also the birthday of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So we will reflect on his life and teachings on Sunday for the satsang, the story of Chaitanya. Next Wednesday we will continue with the study, and on Tuesday and Saturday, Arati and meditation will also continue. Let's conclude with a prayer. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.